sure if this is working, but I used to come out to this place for new thoughts. This time I'm here to recite you some old ones. After not releasing an album for 6 years, Shearwater's The Great Awakening was referred to as reviewers as a return to form, more similar to their island arc than either Animal Life or Jet Plane and Oxbow. This return to form, however, isn't content unless it critiques the idea so that forms should even be returned to. Wonder how different I look compared to the previous time when I was here. Shearwater is a band that I first discovered in March of 2017. I proceeded not to listen to any of their discography, and only then discovered that they existed through Alcohol River, who I also then didn't even listen to until 2019. I tried to get into Shearwater apparently sometime in 2020. I have no memory of this, but my Spotify shows that I did like a few of their songs that year. Eventually, when I was shopping in a Portland CD store, they were closing. Rest in peace, Everyday Music, on whichever one is not open anymore. They had a clearance sale, 75% off. I saw some of their albums, so I grabbed the two that I remember hearing something about, Palo Santo and Winged Life. Winged Life? I don't know how you want to pronounce that one. So I was like, okay, fine, I'll give them another chance. And I then didn't listen to them for like 2 days after I bought them, and then I did listen to them on my drive from Portland, Oregon, which is where I am now, from my drive from Portland, Oregon to Yellowstone National Park. Technically, my drive was only to outside of Yellowstone, one of those cities that then kind of got screwed over when the floods happened, and there was no one trafficking from Yellowstone all the way up to a different place. So that was fun. So on my way fleeing to the woods, however, I found out I love this band. Palo Santo was their first album I actually fully listened to, and it has made it to my top 10 albums with relative ease. And then during my 5-month time working in Yellowstone National Park, not as a park ranger, but just as a hotel worker, that's when they dropped Great Awakening. Picked the right time to get interested in the band. My first listen, adored it, thought this is great, I love this. Subsequent listens, though, my enjoyment had lessened, mostly because the second half is very mellow. And so it definitely made it less like, is this as good as their other stuff? I don't know. However, my opinion is now that it has way surpassed the original opinion. I now think it's great. Top 3 at least, maybe top 2. And it's mostly from how it's revealed its themes to me. I mean, with it being called The Great Awakening, you can kind of guess that this is going to have some religious themes to it. If you know history and religious history, then you can tell, like, oh, this is a historical reference. These are a paraphrase of Wikipedia's. So just look up this on Wikipedia, and you'll probably get better information. But this is how I've decided to write it down myself. The second Great Awakening, we're skipping the first one because it wasn't too relevant. We'll only be covering the second and the fourth. A central belief to the second Great Awakening was the return of Christ. I think it's millennialists. And because of this, Christians believed that they had a responsibility to purify the world in preparation for his return. This purification of the world idea led to Christians moving away from a lot of Calvinism and instead taking responsibility into their own hands. With Calvinism being those who are saved, those who are not. It could lead you to not really caring to actually act on anything because, I'm saved, if I'm saved, and if I'm not, I'm not, so whatever. Hopefully me moving this around like this doesn't mess with the audio. However, due to it having that personal responsibility aspect, contrary to a lot of the kind of gross religious blame game we see now, it led to a lot more positive change. It led to stuff. It was referred to as the social gospel, which, the gospel is all about your interactions between other people and not about you and Jesus, but I'll get there. By believing they were responsible for purifying society, therefore, they had an understanding of societal responsibility. They fought for prison reforms and abolition. Man, that'd be cool if Christians, like, cared about black people and, reforming prisons. So that was the Second Great Awakening. Then the fourth one comes along. Contrary to the Second Great Awakening, the fourth saw a focus on your relationship with Jesus, the thing I mentioned, and with it, the rise of megachurches. Faith was no longer about social responsibility, but, how you and Jesus walk together. You walking with Jesus has nothing to do with interpersonal relations between you and other people, because why would how you interact with Jesus affect you at all? This isn't on the script. In this, forgetting, in this there's a lot of just forgetting about how the Bible's a lot more about you and others than you and God. Because, I hate to break it to you, you and God doesn't affect shit if you don't change how you interact with others, yada yada yada. I'm sure you know that. I think most of us will probably agree megachurches weren't necessarily the best thing. I mean, I know lots of people, Christians, take preference in numbers, and so when they say megachurch, they see that is a lot of numbers, that is a lot of people on our team, but that doesn't mean anything. So, if it doesn't matter if you have lots of people on your team, if your team isn't actually doing the things that your team has supposed to been doing. Anyways, a track by track of the songs on this album, except for the ones that I'm cutting because I didn't feel like they were thematically the most relevant to the discussion at hand. So, seeing that this is, kind of about nostalgia and stuff like that, it's interesting that it begins with the lyrics, "Here comes your heart attack, starless and Bible black." These lyrics are either a reference to Dylan Thomas's Under the Milkwood, or it's a reference to the sixth album by King Crimson, also titled Starless and Bible Black. Or it could be referencing both. And immediately, right out of the gate, the album is referencing other works of art. In an album that's called a return to form, I will waste no time in letting you know, I don't get Dylan Thomas. I had a friend be like, "Hey, read one of these poems." I'm like, "Oh, that was weird." He's like, "What happened?" I just immediately checked out. He's like, "I know, that's what happened. It's when you read Dylan Thomas." I think my friend's right. Sorry if you like Dylan Thomas. I don't get him. My brain checks out every time I read him. I do poetry stuff. I like poetry. I don't like Dylan Thomas. If you like him, again, sorry. Maybe I just need to be in a better headspace when I read it, or maybe I need to do drugs when I read it next time. Again, though, with it being a callback, these first moments immediately call to mind past albums. I'll just read what I said. Sonically, it's a softer opening than either of their two previous albums, and like Palo Santo and Rook of the Island Arc, the song first begins quiet, only to leave that silence behind for a sudden increase in volume. I will now throw up on screen the Audacity wave thing, so you can see just how similar all of these are in audio form. Would you look at that? Those are pretty similar, and I understand anyone who calls this album a return to form. The song then, like a lot of those ones, will just fade out, and it fades out into the lines, "Wake in a dark hotel, Archangel Gabriel, unbound, unholy, and free." So, there we go. Religious imagery. That's probably important. Especially seeing that the next song begins with, "God lives only in the mind, but in the mind it is alive, and to feel and believe otherwise is natural. That's no reason to cry." Track 2 continues this religious language, but instead of it being a revival, like the Great Awakenings were, instead it is closer to disbelief. The disbelief doesn't fully write it off, as it does state that God is alive, though how alive is kind of questionable. Perhaps it's just that when belief causes action, therefore the belief is given life. So that's how, when we say, God is the reason why people act this way, regardless of God exists outside of the mind, and that's how he exists in the mind. Though it could also, then you can follow it too, since the Second Great Awakening actually had good results come from it, like abolition, prison reform, stuff like that, even like some women's rights stuff. So again, wow, Christians could do this stuff? Because of that, quote, there's no reason to cry. Because even if God is only in the mind, maybe the fact that good can come from religion is a good thing, even if it isn't true. And yeah, perhaps that's enough to justify the belief. If it will lead to those things, it doesn't matter one way or another. But then we get to later on in the song, the line, "Where does your mind go?" And saying that God lives there seems to imply brain's going somewhere. It's not like it's not really a critical mind, but maybe something more to a wandering one. It sounds more like you're asking, hey, where are you taking God? When asking, where does your mind go, after saying that's where God lives? I'll catch up with you in a different location. It is really cold and I shouldn't have taken off a second layer. My hands are freezing right now. What did you expect? A crowd only wants one thing. Or start over entirely. This opening line could be viewed in many ways, and perhaps should be viewed as many simultaneously. In the sense of a band, the crowd only wants to hear the hits, hear what they know, and if viewed this way, it seems to very much be reflecting on nostalgia. You could also look at it like politically or religiously, and it's easy to think of crowds as wanting someone to lead them, be that God, a pastor, a political leader, anything of that sort. Or, if we take a more general look, which I think is what I should be doing, we should think of them as crowds as an object, because they're all there for probably the same reason. It's a crowd. They tend to gather for a specific purpose. And so you could read the line, therefore, as the crowd wants, but not as individuals, but as a collective. In all these situations, I would argue, though, the crowd is there because of past actions. If you're there for the hits, that's because you've, seen the previous things and you want to hear them again. If it's for religious, you probably have you've had a previous religious experience. A friend of yours did. You're chasing after something that's already happened. In, I'd say, pretty much all of these experiences. Or the fact that, even if you haven't had a religious experience, because Catholics and they don't really think that way, it's still based on a past covenant and still something involving the past. Which, to say actions are based upon things that happened in the past sounds a bit dull, but I think it's important in the context of an album all about nostalgia. Especially later on we get to the line, the question is, how can you fool the mind? You fool the body. If we continue the thought of the previous song, fooling the mind would be fooling where God is. And by fooling the body, it means you have control over what are the characteristics of God. If we keep the religious theme, Christians often refer to themselves as the body of Christ. Christians are more susceptible to fascist rhetoric, as Christianity is based on faith and miracles. Miracles are things that are contrary to observable logic and reason. This leads to them being naturally more predisposed to the lies they were told by fascists. They were willing to believe with blind faith as it was taught to them as a good thing. This is how they can be presented with proof that a person they follow is a liar and still follow them. On to track 5. Endlessly wrestling, talk and don't pause for breath. Seems to refer to talk that is either desperate or going to run out of ability or trying not to let any other word in. And later on we have the line, turn your back against the evidence, and again, could be read as very fascist, suppressing truth and stuff like that mentioned earlier. It is really beautiful out here, by the way. Not sure how good the camera's doing, but it is beautiful out here. time the script is going to be 3 pages long. Enough of the sad, wasted hours dreaming of country life is how Empty Orchestra begins. Fascism is built upon weaponized nostalgia for the good days. You can idealize some version of the past that never existed, but those were wasted hours. You can wish for a return to Christian America, but that doesn't matter how far you go back. It's a myth. It didn't happen. You go back far enough, it's either slavery or killing the natives. There's never a moment where we're living out the Christian ideals that they want, or at least claim they want, because, there was always going to be those unbiblical, ungodly practices. But then again, if you say unbiblical, then you can get into a conversation, because you can probably use the Bible to justify anything. You know what you need, while the sun burns through a lake of ice, but there is no real change, and that's why we know this is over now. While you were dreaming of that country life, the world is collapsing. You pine for a world you can't have, while the one you have is dying. Nostalgia stops you from noticing the beauty of this world, and it's tragic. And what have you done? What have you learned from all these stubborn people? When you watch them dreaming out loud, what progress have you made? The world isn't changing the way you claim to want it to. To make a personal observation, I worked at Yellowstone National Park. I worked there at the Old Faithful Lodge. I was a front desk worker, and we referred to ourselves as the unofficial visitor center due to how many people would come up to us asking questions that were not for us, like, hey, where do we go to watch those educational videos? Where's your theater? And we'd say the visitor center. They'd always be like, this isn't the visitor center? We'd get a lot of people who were older, people with Confederate flags on their jacket, people with Trump hats, all of that stuff. And it's a bit weird, considering that while Trump was a president, he cut funding to the national parks, and they're here loving them, loving this nature, but voting for people who actively are harming it. It's a strange cognitive dissonance to love nature while carelessly letting it just die. On top of this, Yellowstone is arguably closer to a deadly Disneyland than nature, with its perfectly curated paths, maps of where to go and what to see, and wait times for the coming attractions. I mean, with it being deadly, it was a bit weird that they found a foot just in, was it Crested Pool during my time there? I'm not going to look up which pool it was. I think it was Crested. It's in West Thumb, I know that much. And a census from 2016 said that 24% of the visitors were 18 or younger, but that's not really a good job at representing probably the youth who go there, seeing that they're probably under their parents' control and that sort of thing. So probably more accurate to look at like what people and more of my generation are doing would be the fact that 14% of the visitors were aged, I don't have this memorized and I put a bad page break, 19 through 35. While younger people tend to be more concerned with the planet's health, fascinatingly, they don't visit the parks. Perhaps just a lack of free time or spare change. Perhaps it's they don't appreciate the politics of the NPS. Understandable, that's fair. But, it's a bit weird that then baby boomers are, 39% of the people going there. And vote-wise, they don't seem to be caring. The sun's coming out. I don't know if that's showing up. I'll be honest, I moved to Yellowstone for 5 months because I wanted to move away from society, to be in nature, quote unquote, that bullshit, My fellow employees in Yellowstone spent most of their free hours drunk, high, or horny. If I had to pick, I'd pick drunk. I say this, probably like 95% of them. There was definitely a few people who weren't that, but a lot of the people were there either running away from something or just taking it as, like, think of it like college. You can party, but you're only there for 5 months, so none of the consequences get to follow you. It's great if you want to do that. Don't. my schedule lined up with basically none of my friends, so hiking alone is not really the best idea in deadly Disneyland, and so I found myself spending probably a third of my free days just driving into the nearest town, be that West Yellowstone, or if I really was having a bad day, Bozeman, because I could get food that wasn't white people food there. I mean, you could also get some in West Yellowstone. If you do go to West Yellowstone, Red Lotus, I think is the name of the restaurant, and it's really good. Ignore the fact that it has like 3 out of 5 stars. It's a good place. I was disappointed to find myself unable to achieve that desire for the woods, for nature. The dream was wasted hours. That's because dream of country life is a selfish desire. It's the desire to possess something and not to restore something. In the same vein as the national parks, it's the individualistic you and Jesus relationship focus that came from the Fourth Great Awakening that undid a lot of social activism that came from the Second Great Awakening. It led to more megachurches and conservative theologies, contrary to the progressive movement of the Second Great Awakening. When the focus becomes you and Jesus, you miss out on the whole purpose of faith. It's very clear all of the things Jesus says to do are in relation to you and other people. You don't pray in like public and that sort of stuff because that's about you and other people. Like, that's not how you interact with other people. You need to be focusing on you and other people. Everything in the Bible's about that. The whole you and Jesus thing, probably a good thing to do. Not the most important. Do something else. In the description for this album, the band's page describes this specific song as superficially triumphant, empty orchestra turns out, on closer inspection, to be a reckoning with nihilism's seductive appeal. Now, if I can actually get the pages to separate, since they've been getting rained on. Because perhaps the ideal nostalgia is just nihilistic escapism. What is the purpose of these desires? These desires to remove oneself from the world. It is counter to social activism. If anything, it's closer to the ideals of fascism. It's making a place for just the self. It's about excluding everyone else. It's also possibly relevant to mention the fact that the term the Great Awakening has been co-opted by the QAnon movement in a way similar to how they've misused the term take the red pill. That one's really funny. And while the Island Arc trilogy always has the climax of the album at the second to last song, it's different here. This is the loudest the album goes. The next 5 songs are very mellow all throughout, which is why I didn't really care for it my first listen. And we'll get to why my opinions changed at the next location. Look at him. He's wrong. And he knows. He enjoys it. When asked if they were talking about Trump in a Reddit Ask Me Anything, they said, and all those like him. This falls in line with the previous lyrics. Turning your back against the evidence. You're knowing you're wrong, and you're enjoying it. Kind of explicit proof here that this album is about fascism. This album's also... Reviewers describe it as peaceful. The writer has described the song as oppressive and crushing. I think are close enough words. Then we get to this song that kind of solidified my opinions as this being a good album upon re-listen. Detritivore. Detritivores are, to quote the Google dictionary definition, I'm just going off of that one because it was the first one that shows up. I guess I'm lazy. An animal which feeds on dead organic material, especially plant detritus. The song begins with a sample. When asked about the sample, why is it blurring? The sample, I'm not sure. It's cut up from a different vocal phrase. I can't remember which one. I think it got dropped in there by mistake, but it hypnotized us, so we left it in. The title could be read as a conversation with sampling, but even more relevant are the lyrics. Quote, "Do you remember? Everyone look at your hands." And, Where do you come from, and where do you go? Maybe it's just me, but when I think of those lines, the things that come to mind are Safety Dance and Cotton Eye Joe. Calling this song Detried of War while referencing nostalgic songs appears to call nostalgia the consumption of dead things. They served their purpose, they died, and yet here we are continuing to consume them. Or, I did a bit more research, and my mind is now more confused, and I don't know which one I think it is. Anyways, here's the other evidence. It seems strange to pick these songs specifically for your example of nostalgia to be critiqued, but it's possibly relevant that these songs about dancing, but probably more relevant is the fact that, and it sounds dumb, Safety Dance was an anti-establishment song. It was meant to be angsty, and now that context is gone. It's now just fun radio hits. Woo. No one probably knows off the top of their head what the dance looks like that they're saying they should be able to do in clubs. But yeah, that's what it was about. The meanings doesn't matter. It's not that anymore. It's also probably relevant, though, that Cotton Eye Joe, the most well-known version of that song is a Swedish dance remix of an old American slave song. I did not know that until I researched this. I'm not going to be able to listen to the song the same way. Yeah. Huh. Just so everyone's aware, this is what I'm using now to hold this up because it fell over, and I don't think it's going to be stable otherwise. Far across the day, carrying the hopes of a former life that never fully died, holding its shape in your mind again. Well, we get more mind reference, and more, therefore, more God reference. The wind's now picked up enough to make it a bit harder to hold the page. That's now a bit more damp than it used to be. I'm going to once again read a quote from the Ask Me Anything that Jonathan Meiburg, the singer and lead musician, did. Quote, "But I can share one interesting tidbit. We only tracked strings for 5 of the songs. The rest of the songs that feature strings, which I guess are all on side 2, are the same string parts as the first 4, re-edited and processed in various ways. The final string flourish on Wind is Love, for example, this is the last song on the album, is all the string parts from all these songs played at once. The strings are wonderfully intentionally sounding for some reason. Whatever they're doing, it seems like they're supposed to be doing it." The song ending with reused strings from previous songs plays even more to the idea of Detried of War, or all other references to other pieces of media. It's now self-referential within itself, I think it's fair to say that this is probably not the album critiquing itself for sampling, which means we need to really be thinking, okay, what is it trying to say about sampling? And maybe it's that this material is different because it's currently alive. It hasn't been released yet. When he made it, it wasn't out there. Or perhaps it's stating that nostalgia can be feasting on dead material, or the fact that dead material can still be nourishing. I'll be honest, I don't fully know. I've tried to think this through, and I've gotten multiple answers and not one concrete one. So I'm just going to give you all of them. And, maybe it's not exactly as cut and dry at what nostalgia is bad. And I'll get more to that in a second, but now the album's over. That's the last song. And a possible question we were left with is, are things that were previously good sometimes necessary to be thrown out? That was my initial question, but I know it was my previous question, but I think now it's the wrong question to be asking. Perhaps the real question we should be asking is, are we losing sight of what's good because of nostalgia? Maybe it's nihilism and individualism that strip meaning from once good things. Perhaps nostalgia, God, nature, whatever. It's not that it's terrible or that it's run its course. It's that it can be misused. If God lives in the mind and nostalgia colors our view of the world, control over nostalgia can control our thoughts of who God is, or the land we grew up in, or the history of the church, or whatever. It doesn't matter. Nostalgia can color all of it, and if God lives in the mind, if we're following that through, there you go, you got control. Should we throw away the NPS? If we did, we'd probably just drill for oil on the land, so maybe it's not the right call. That sounds worse than having mismanaged parks with questionable politics. Should we throw away God? That's already an option for anyone, so it doesn't really matter what I say. Should we throw away nostalgia? And maybe we just need to be better at recognizing what we already have. We can try to wait for or force old things to function the same way as they once did, but time does not work that way. Their disappearance must not lead to selfish nihilism. There must be an appreciation of the beauty and meaning, even if this is subjective meaning. The act of existing is counter to nihilism, and so we must struggle for meaning when the old ones leave.